Yeah, some years ago, my wife Chris and I visited Woolsthorpe Manor, Newton's family home near Grantham, and on the walls there, inscribed into the plasterwork, were some rather interesting geometrical graffiti. And I thought, well, this is fair enough. Young Newton, precocious lad, and it was, I think, accepted at Woolsthorpe at the time that Newton was responsible for these drawings, and that may or may not be the case. But certainly, it was rather more interesting a story than that, and I've been looking into that more recently, as we shall see. So, this is by way of a speculation, really. Young Newton may well have been responsible, and I think he was for at least some of it, but it's not absolutely certain. Here are some of the drawings, inscribings into the plasterwork which we saw, and these are very typical, not just of simple geometric drawings, but of anti-witch marks or anti-evil marks, and you find them in very widespread locations, mostly in churches and cathedrals actually, but also in domestic buildings such as Woolsthorpe Manor, and they generally date, insofar as we can date them, from the late medieval into the early modern period, say up to the 1650s or thereabouts, but we're not absolutely certain of the dates. You remember that young Newton had his marvellous year in roughly 1666 or thereabouts, when he had to leave Cambridge, go back to Woolsthorpe because of the plague. And that's when he was undertaking his experiments with light being made up, white light being made up of the various colours of the spectrum. He was probably starting to think about gravity, which ultimately became written up as in the Principia, and possibly also thinking about witches and witchcraft. We don't know for certain, but the belief in witchcraft and the powers of evil were quite widespread, even into the time when Newton was a youngster. Of course, he was born on Christmas Day in 1642 on the old Julian calendar. And we do know for certain that in his later life, he had a very, very strong interest in all manner of occult matters: alchemy, astrology, numerology, Kabbalistic signs. And the question is, when did he start with all of this? We do know that when he became an alchemist in his early middle ages, you might say, when he was at Cambridge, he was looking not so much for the philosopher's stone to transmute base metal into gold. He was really in the search for what you might call the ultimate answer to the ultimate question, of life, the universe, and everything. And he put so much effort into this, he eventually ended up having something of a nervous breakdown. The poet Dryden remarked, "Great wits are sure to madness near allied." And that certainly was the case with Newton. It all got very much too much for him for a few years. A little background context. The witch craze, so-called, in Europe was not actually quite so bad in England. It was much worse in Scotland and much worse in the continent. By the way, witches were never burned in England. Witchcraft was a crime. There were several anti-witchcraft acts put in force, and hence witchcraft was a crime. It was not a heresy. So witches who were condemned were hanged, not burned. And there was a later upsurge in the Civil War in the 1640s, 1644, with Matthew Hopkins in East Anglia, the so-called witchfinder general. But mostly it was earlier than that. The European witch craze, we could date it very roughly from 1400 to about 1780, when it finally and irrevocably died out. And it was at its worst for about 100 years, from 1580 to 1680, though by that time it had more or less died out in England some years previously. Now, what are these markings that we find, these geometric and indeed other markings? Well, there are lots of theories as to what it might be, what they might represent, and why they were made. And you can, as it were, pick your own theory. But generally speaking, it's held that these were inscribed in buildings as protection marks. protect not necessarily against actual witches, the persons of witches, but against what was called maleficium, the force of evil, or perhaps even evil spirits. King James the First of England, Sixth of Scotland, had written a book a few years before he came King of England called Demonology. He was very, very keen on this sort of thing. The devil will come and pierce through whatever house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, by whatsoever opening the air may enter in at. So doors, windows, chimneys, which of course had to remain open, were possible points of entry for maleficium, and that tends to be where you find some of these drawings and scrapings and scratchings, particularly in a domestic context. These are generally given the name of apotropaic marks, apotropaic from the Greek meaning turning away, which marks is a bit confusing really, because it was also held that the devil left marks on the body of the witch. So really anti-witch marks, or these days they simply tend to be called ritual protection marks. And here's a display, a collection of these geometric signs. You can see that they have petals and multiple circles, etc., and circles within circles. These have been known for a very long time. They are very ancient, some of them. They've certainly been found on the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and they probably go back to the Middle East a long time before that. Depending on the number of petals that you've got in the drawing, there might be quatrefoils with 4, hexafoils with 6, triskelions with a sort of Celtic 3-element intertwining. But you have to be very careful not to confuse them with masons' marks. Masons, of course, made their own markings, but most of the ones you can see displayed on the diagram here are thought to be apotropaic marks rather than masons' marks, because they occur quite frequently in lots and lots of places. Lincoln Cathedral, I think, if you look at the whole sum total of graffiti, including people's names, initials and dates, the work is still ongoing, but so far about 1,500 have been logged just in Lincoln Cathedral itself. One sign which was popular is the pentangle, the 5-pointed star. Although we these days tend to associate it with black magic and witchcraft, that really is a 19th and 20th century notion. Back in previous times, pre-1700 or whatever, well, pre-1800, it was very much a Christian symbol. And if you know the legend of the poem Gawain and the Green Knight, Sir Gawain had a 5-pointed star painted on the front of his shield for protection. Daisy wheels were usually inscribed, we think, with compasses or a pair of dividers. Here's one in a tithe barn in Bradford on Avon. You can see that there are multiple of these carved at various different times. Dating them is a real problem. You also find these things called Marian or Marian marks, where you have a sort of M sign, or if upside down, a VV sign. The VV is often taken to be shorthand for Virgo Virginum, Virgin of Virgins. But you pay your money, you take the choice. They've also been found in Cresswell Crags Caves in Derbyshire. Again, here's the sort of VV markings. Often they have a bar across the top for reasons we don't really understand. Here are some markings from Haseby in Lincolnshire, and very interesting, I'll come back to that in a moment. You can see that here there's a windmill, a post mill complete with its 4 sails. Not quite sure what that is, a complex design. Obviously not all of these are geometric designs or designs of buildings or structures. Very often they're simply names of people who just couldn't avoid the urge to make their own mark. In those days, of course, there wasn't any such thing as the Ministry of Works forbidding people scratching on monuments, and indeed it seemed to be quite an acceptable thing to do in our churches and cathedrals, which is rather interesting. I quite like this one. Anybody scratching on this monument will be spanked. I can only think that that's not a genuine thing, but it's rather amusing. There are also apotropaic marks on the timbers in these buildings. perhaps in the roof work or between the floors. I don't know whether that's the case at Woolsthorpe Manor. I haven't seen anything about that, but perhaps the floorboards haven't yet been taken up. And here's another of these pentangles on the woodwork of a building. Question is, who made the marks? Well, we know that in the cathedrals and the churches, it was the general populace, as you might say. It has been said that in churches, everyone, from the lord of the manor to the lowliest commoner, was making these marks. That may or may not be the case. It's possible that when they're in domestic buildings, houses and barns, that as part of the construction, perhaps the craftsmen or even the local cunning man or wise man might have been called in to make these marks to turn away evil. As I've said, they're often thought to have been created with dividers. Small ones could have been made with a pair of domestic shears like this, turning one point around another. And the question might be asked, how do these marks work? That is, how did the people who believed in them believe them to work, to turn away evil? Well, it's not at all certain. It may be that they didn't particularly care. They were just they just had them on their buildings and their structures as a general sort of good luck charm, if you like. But there is a suggestion with the geometric ones that it formed a kind of endless line, circles within circles, petals within petals, so that if a demon came along and was attracted to this sign, because it's an endless sign, they would get trapped within the markings of the sign and wouldn't be able to get out. I can't help but think that any demon who fell for that must have been a bit thick, but there we have it. It's thought that, generally speaking, these marks either repelled evil or, as I've just said, trapped the evil within them. Obviously, it would be better to repel it than not, but how they actually achieved this feat is not at all sure. It's lost in the mists of antiquity. Of course, it's unfortunately the case that people didn't record when and where and why they made these marks. We have the markings, but no documentation to go with them, nor do we know which particular signs they decided to use. And as I say, this is all attempting to repel or guard against maleficium, not necessarily particular witches. Often in buildings you also find strange things like old boots and shoes, and perhaps even things like these, the so-called Bellarmine bottles, which are imported from the Rhineland. These are often called witch bottles, and they tend to contain rusty old nails, nail clippings, bits of people's hair, etc., often urine as well. But they could also be used for black magic. If you boiled up some of these things, particularly somebody's hair, in urine and then placed it hidden away in the person's house, you could wreak spells and devastation upon them. Anyway, what about the marks of Woolsthorpe Manor themselves? Woolsthorpe was built, we think, about 1627. We don't know the definite date. And here's one of the geometric designs, which was quite possibly scribed by Isaac Newton. You can see that it's been preserved. These geometric designs have been deliberately preserved at Woolsthorpe. Here's a higher contrast view of the same image. You can see that there's a nice circle around, and the lines, this vertical line or these horizontal lines, are nice and straight, done with a ruler presumably, but these others are very much hand drawn and they're rather scrappy, which is interesting. Don't know why, but as I've said, these have been deliberately preserved, probably since the time very few years after the house was built, but we can't be absolutely certain. A few years ago, a new drawing was discovered at Woolsthorpe Manor, and the website that I saw it on didn't say where it was found. So I had a look at my photographs that I took when I was there. It was actually here on the left-hand side of this main fireplace. You remember that chimneys could be a possible place of ingress of evil, and that's the area that we're looking at. And it's not very clear to see. If we fill it in with lines, you can see that it looks rather like a windmill, but we don't know what these lines are here, on its sort of wooden truss support. But there are no sails. Now, some of these apotropaic marks take the form of buildings. We don't know what it means or why they are there. So it may not be a mill at all, but a depiction of a building. But it looks rather like a post mill without its sails. And there are other scratchings around either side of it, which again are quite typical of these apotropaic marks, which are possibly thought to be so-called Jacob's ladders to heaven, but we really have very little idea of their meaning. Interestingly, elsewhere in Woolsthorpe is this drawing possibly made in pencil or even charcoal, and again it looks to be made by the same hand if we compare it with the one by the fireplace. Again, it looks like a post mill, but with no sails. It's really rather odd. So it quite possibly has some other distinct meaning. These things are scattered around Woolsthorpe. Nowhere in Woolsthorpe is particularly far from a doorway or some point of ingress. They're not all designs. Some are just people's names and scratchings, presumably rather later visitors. But nowhere is particularly far from an opening at Woolsthorpe, so it's not surprising that there are quite a few to be found. Can we date the marks? Well, as I said, there are no documentary records as to who and why and when they were made, so we can only just conjecture, really. We think that these marks are mostly, as you might call, early modern, which is really dated from 1485 to, I suppose, about 1700, in all sorts of buildings, including churches. Was Newton responsible? We can't be certain. I have a suspicion that he probably was, since they're quite childish, some of the drawings, and the others with the dividers might have been made by a craftsman shortly after the house was built, but we don't know. William Stukely, the very, very well-known antiquarian of the time, was a friend and biographer of our Isaac, and he wrote that the walls and ceilings were full of drawings which he'd made with charcoal. There were birds, beasts, men, ships, plants, mathematical figures, circles and triangles. So that would figure with what still exists today. The drawings were very well done. Scarce a board in the partitions about the room, that is his bedroom, without Isaac Newton cut upon it. I've heard likewise that at Grantham School, before the present seats and desks were set up, he had cut his name into the old ones upon all the places where he had sat, with the date of the year in his several removes. So he's a bit of a compulsive carver, you might say. In order of probability, who made the marks? Well, I think Isaac probably made some of them. The building, which may or may not be a mill, for instance, the charcoal drawing. I suspect he was quite capable of doing the geometric designs as well. It's possible that a craftsman made it, some of them at least, shortly after Woolsthorpe was built. It's unlikely his father made them. His father made very shortly before Isaac was born, actually, and his stepfather, who married obviously Isaac's mother, they didn't live at Woolsthorpe, so it's very unlikely that he was responsible either. It's just possible that the local cunning man had been called in for the purpose. But whoever created them, young Isaac must have known about them, and he must have been, since he was a curiously minded chap, he must have known about the local folklore and ideas about witches, witchcraft, and maleficium, evil, bad luck, evil spirits, etc. Did they influence his thinking in his later studies? Was he influenced by these, what you might call, folk magic traditions? Well, it's interesting to speculate. Maleficium, of course, is a force of a sort, but it's undetectable. It's a force of evil which is known only by its effects. And what does that also apply to? Well, it applies to gravity. Newton obviously came up with a mathematical description of how gravity works, but he didn't know what the force actually was, how it was communicated between one gravitating body, one body with mass, and another one. And it was the problem of action at a distance. You may well remember that at Albert Einstein although he was thinking about quantum theory. He didn't like the idea of one particle being entangled with another, so that if you affected one, the other particle also responded. He called it spooky action at a distance, which is rather interesting. Physicists don't like action at a distance without something being in between, even if they can only call it a field of some description. Some sort of intermediate vector is required. Newton himself, of course, famously said, "Hypotheses non fingo." I frame no hypotheses about what the nature of gravity truly is and how it communicates between two bodies. In the 1713 edition of Principia, he says, "Hypotheses, whether metaphysical or physical, or based on occult qualities or mechanical, have no place in experimental philosophy." So he's trying to distance himself from these earlier ways of thinking and adopting a neutral position. Why are the marks still there? Well, maybe it was thought that they're not going to do any harm, and they might actually do some good as good luck charms. It's possible that they were kept as historical curios, because Newton became very famous, of course, within his own lifetime, and after that, well, you weren't going to destroy them if you thought that Newton had actually made them himself. There is a claim, however, that they're all 19th century fakes just to attract the tourists with their money, which I think that's rather unlikely. So I would simply say this: the next time you go to visit Woolsthorpe Manor, just have a careful look around you and have a think about these designs and drawings and what they might represent. And don't forget to take your lucky charm. Okay, that's me done. Thank you.
It was interesting.
Thank you very much.
You need to unmute yourselves if you want your applause to be heard.
Ray, how easy was it to research these things? Was there any great depth of sort of knowledge available about the nature of these markings? Because it's quite interesting.
Well, I'm a member of a local history group. I really just very recently got interested in these apotropaic markings, so-called, and I started to go around local churches looking for them. And the local stone is very gritty sandstone. It's not very good material for the scribing, but I have found quite a number. They take well, there are many different kinds of markings, which I won't go into particularly, but really it's a growing field of inquiry over this dozen years or so, and there's one or two books available now which describe these things both in churches and in domestic dwellings. So it's a growing field, really, and I just lit upon it recently when I saw reference to this new drawing, the one of the possibly windmill, or possibly not, which had been found at Woolsthorpe, and I just made me look over my old photographs till I found out where it was, and I really just been reading up and taking it from there. But it is very much a modern field, and there are surveys underway. The first one started in Norfolk and then Suffolk, and it's spreading across East Anglia and indeed Lincolnshire now, and more people are getting into it. It's yet to spread properly into the north and the northwest, but it doubtless will do, and there's no reason to believe that these markings were just confined to the southeast part of the country. We just haven't found them yet further afield.
Yeah, well, what's quite interesting when you mentioned this idea that they could have possibly made by the local, you call cunning man or medicine man, cunning man.
Well,
it makes me wonder if there was, because these things were done, we're assuming specifically with the purpose of avoiding some kind of evil force, if there was any kind of ritualistic nature to these markings be made, and therefore would there be any tools that may have survived that would be used specifically for carving these marks? Because some of those pentangles look very, very neatly done. I was trying to work out if they'd been done in one stroke, or if it didn't look like they'd been carved or hammered into them, because the marks were very neat. So I wondered if there was sort of a ritualistic element to the formation of these marks, and whether or not there had actually been tools that were specific to that purpose, which may well survive today. We just think they may be used for some other purpose.
Yeah, I don't think there are any specific apotropaic marking tools as such. People use whatever was to hand, and some of them are simply freehand scratchings. Some of them are deeper than others, but undoubtedly some of them were done with hammer and chisel, and everything in between, apart from your fingernails, really. So I don't think there's any specific tools required for it. But in the churches and the cathedrals, it's very clear that some people who just wanted to literally make their mark with their initials, you find this up on LT Moore. Some people in the 19th century would go up with a whacking great chisel and hammer and bash their initials into the cow and calf rocks, for instance. There's obviously a great deal of that in the cathedrals. The interesting thing is that the church authorities don't seem to have minded. Certainly in the pre-Reformation period, parish churches in particular seem to have been, well, I was going to say fair game, but community resources, where people would go and meet and perhaps make contracts and all sorts of things. It was a handy place to meet up, and there were all sorts of markings, often in the porches or the entryways rather than in the main body of the church. It may be that the entryways had a special different status, and you didn't particularly make too many marks in the main church, although they certainly do exist in many forms. Yeah.
Can I just say, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Can I just interrupt? Two things. One is there's a very interesting book which I've got, Medieval Graffiti. The Lost Voice of England's Churches, Matthew Champion, which tells you all about these signs. But the other thing I was just going to say was, and I'm sure Ray knows this already, if you go to a medieval church, well, say go to York Minster, you'll find there's a big ceremonial entranceway on the south side. You won't find one on the north side. The reason being that in the medieval worldview, the north was the realm of Satan. The south, as you went further south, was not the realm of Satan. So very often a medieval church would have a big ceremonial arch on the south side, just have a plain door on the north side. The reason for the door on the north side, which was often kept open, was if there was any evil spirits about. For example, if a baby had been baptized to do an exorcism on the baby, and the evil spirits were given a chance to get out, so they had the north door, so they could go out the north door. Evil spirits would not go out the south door, they'd go the north to the north.
Although one of our local parish churches just down the road from us here at South Ormsby, it does have its porch on the north side, not on the south side. But I have to say that I have found a couple of apotropaic markings on that north porch masonry.
Could I just say, additional to that, Ray, if you look at graveyards around medieval churches, the only people buried on the north side were usually suicides or people who were not very good. The south side in medieval churches is usually like our local church up here, Crofton, which is genuine medieval. The only graves on the north side are modern ones. The historical ones are all on the south side, the same at Sandal Church, which is just around the corner from where I live.
David's got his hand raised.
Yeah, I've got the National Trust booklet about Woolsthorpe Manor, and I just looked at it just now, and I noticed it says the graffiti at the base of the stairs is thought to have been left by a visiting scholar, Professor John Robison of St Andrews University, which sounds an irresponsible thing for a scholar to do. I don't know what that was, but do you know what that graffiti is? That it's
I don't. I'll have to look that one up. Yeah. Base of a stairway.
Yes. And then in another thing, it says the domino-like pattern on another graffiti is thought to be a farmer's stock tally.
Well, who knows? Yeah. Who knows? Yes. Some of these marks I'm mentioning about church doorways, there are crosses often to be found on church porches and entryways, and it's one of the suggestions is that people would meet at the church porch, farmers or traders or whatever, and they would make an informal contract, and they might well both be illiterate, so they would make their mark by scribing a cross into the stonework. I don't really buy this one, because if that was the case, then said porch would be absolutely covered with crosses, and that's never the case.
Bob, you've got your hand raised?
Yes. So I've read somewhere that sometimes popular things like that are not, don't attract the interest of the historians, like, but you may find reference to it in literature. So I wonder if we could find something like that in the books of the time.
I don't know of any. I mean, as I say, I've only just got into this. Some people have been into it for years, and some of them are like Matt Champion, are very capable people. I'm sure they've looked pretty carefully, but you never know what will turn up. As far as I know, nothing has been found in parish registers, but then very little was written in them, certainly until the 18th century. So, you know, if somebody had been scribing on the back pillar, it wouldn't necessarily appear. You know, it's mostly just births, marriages and deaths, as it were. I don't know of anything. You might have thought again that the antiquarians would have taken an interest, but by the time they came along, most of these marks had already been made and nobody was still making them. So you never know what will turn up. We can only hope.
It's interesting, by the way, and I just looked it up, that Aleister Crowley, who was described as the most evil man in the world, who was very much into black magic at the beginning of the 20th century, apparently in their ceremonies they used the pentagram and the hexagram as you know, in their ceremonies there. So it's quite interesting. They could be used as protection against evil, but they could also be used by practicing black magicians in their ceremonies. All very confusing.
Yeah, well, Aleister Crowley was a bit of a case, wasn't he? But it's quite possible that they'd taken what were in fact sacred symbols and literally inverted the meaning for their own purposes.
Yeah, that's right.
Bill, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, it's just I had a weird thought that these symbols, which appear almost identical from place to place and roughly the same sort of size, there's some guy down the market looking a bit like Tony Robinson selling templates.
Well, I don't suppose they're particularly difficult to do. You know, if you take a pair of dividers and scribe on a piece of wood or a pair of compasses, it's just a matter of placing the pencil and the point in the right order. And once you've done it once, you know how to do it. But the knowledge of how to do it was clearly current in society of the time. If only we knew exactly who was responsible. Can't have been everybody, otherwise the whole buildings would be plastered with these things. And although there are a lot, that is not the case. So as to who had this knowledge and who was to be trusted to make the marks, we can only guess.
Andy, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, it's just more of a sort of personal observation rather than a question, Ray. But I mean, it seems to me that these things are just another manifestation of psychological or social phenomena that have been seen throughout centuries. I mean, back in the 1980s, was it 80s or 70s, we started getting strange circles in cornfields that later became crop circles. They were all geometric patterns, and it happened in one site, first of all, and then there was suddenly a huge rash of them all over the place, including in other countries. And it seems to me that, like UFOs, crop circles, this sort of thing was, to me, seems to be a manifestation of that kind of social phenomena now, really, rather than it. I mean, there probably was some occult sort of meaning attached to them, but it seems to me that human beings do that for some reason, you know, and what they do is seems to be a reflection of the age that they live in.
Yeah, I'm sure there's an element of that, but these things are very, very widespread. How constrained in a particular period of time they were, I don't know. I mean, the crop circles, yes, obviously the people who made them, well, one assumes that most of them didn't believe that they were attracting aliens or dealing with occult forces or whatever. They did it for a laugh and to gull other people, as it were, which they were very successful in doing. I remember being down in Wiltshire many years ago now, and a crop circle had just been made in a field, and the next time I went past, there were loads of cars there and people going into the circle to presumably absorb the vibes or whatever it be. But there was also another one cut on a hillside one evening, and the following day when I drove past again, the farmer had seen it, and he got his combine out and whipped out the whole area. So he wasn't having any of that nonsense. But,
God, what a miserable Herbert.
All these skeptics.
Any more questions for Ray? In that case, can I suggest we have a quick tea break for 10 minutes, and then we'll adjourn at about 9:25. Is that okay?
Yep.